The Wolves of Eternity by Karl Ove Knausgaard was translated into English and released in the United States on September 19th, 2023. It is a continuation of Knausgaard's Morningstar series, though it largely tells the intimate stories of two people in totally different places. In 1986, Sievert, a 19-year-old, returns home from a brief stint in the Navy as a cook when he sees strange dreams of his late father. This prompts him on an investigation of what his father was like before his unnatural death when Sievert was only 12. As if these were not eerie enough, Yor, Sievert's kid brother, has a nightmare of their mother dying, with a bird flying out of her mouth. Not long after, their mother complains of back pain, and she eventually has to go for a consultation. Sievert's return home takes up most of the front half of the novel, while Aleftina takes the majority of the back half. She is a researcher and professor in the field of biology, who navigates a disenchanted life with an annoying and pessimistic poet on the one hand, and her selfish adolescent son on the other. Aleftina takes a flight back home to her father, who is turning 80, which sends her on a journey back into the past as she recounts her growing up with a very precocious father and loving mother, and her intellectual pursuits, which drove her to asking the big questions about life, death, and consciousness. By the time you reach Aleftina's story in the novel, you get the sense that the two lives are interrelated in some way. This is revealed on the book jacket, which I happen to think was a mistake, but I'll leave it up to you to discover whether you want to pursue it. Although the second book has been translated into English in 2023, Knausgaard has just completed his fourth book at the time of this review, so it stands to reason that this is his next major project. For those following along in the series, however, do note that none of the characters from the Morningstar seem present in this work, although there are minor references to shared names that do sort of make you wonder how much connective tissue there is. Rest assured, this is not the kind of sequel most people imagine when they think of the term. Rather, the two exist more as part of an anthology series. The presence of the new star does not occur until well into the novel, basically at the end, which means the novel has little explicitly to do with the narrative conceit that starts the series, though there are vignettes of other characters, ones that take place in the present day, that hint towards the destabilization of the present time. If I read those sections correctly. No, for the majority of the book, it is Knausgaard doing what he does best, writing about the daily lives of two characters in great detail, in some ways to the best of effects. There will be some debate, I am sure, in the coming years, what Knausgaard's best work is, what his legacy should be. Until I had finished The Morningstar, if you would have asked me, I would have said that My Struggle was still his best known and best work, as far as I had read. Now I see, having finished Wolves of Eternity, that I believe Knausgaard to be doing his best work right now. I was skeptical of his return to fiction, because in Book 2 of My Struggle, he had written off the idea of fiction in our time as seeming almost impossible to do right. I was right there with him, agreeing with the idea that the verisimilitude of fiction attempting to emulate life had proliferated into every other form of media, while at the same end becoming so difficult to do in fiction that it turned the form into something maudlin or gaudy. I did not want to like The Morningstar, because I felt like he was going against his principles, but he proved me wrong. Knausgaard, in writing fiction, simply gets more tools at his disposal, more places to reach out and speculate on, and as long as his intuition is good, and it's still good, he could write himself out of anything. Out of the two characters in Wolves of Eternity, Sievert stands out the most. His return home is breathtaking in its sadness and despondency. Sievert, being so young, has no idea how hard life is about to get for him, and yet the reader ends up falling head over heels for Sievert, despite his youth, because the impression you get of him is that he is an incredibly nice, genuine soul. Sievert has desires, of course, but he is apologetic in his outbursts to his mother, he is helpful towards his brother Yor, and even when the stressors mount, and even when Sievert lashes out at the world in ways that surprise even him, he is remorseful and honest with himself. In one particular moment, when it becomes clear to Sievert that something is wrong with his mother, there is a moment when Sievert thinks to himself that he could help out much more at home. He could cook and buy groceries. He could babysit his brother. Whether Sievert is aware of it or not, The reader knows that he is bargaining with the big other in hopes of curing his mother. I cried in this moment because I have been in this exact moment of my life before, where I bargained with the world because of the health of a loved one. In this way, Knausgaard's intuition for a character is extremely accurate. And in 99% of cases with Sievert, Knausgaard's intuition for where to take a character is the exact right decision. In a recent podcast, Knausgaard discusses how he writes 3 pages a day, and he hopes to write a novel a year. This routine by and large means that he does not do what other authors do, like Donna Tartt for example, and that is throw out hundreds of pages if he feels like the story isn't working, quote-unquote, according to their own boundaries of what the story needs to be. This is a high-risk endeavor for an author, exhibiting less control by being more immediate with the writing, because at any point, the story could veer into areas the reader may feel to be inauthentic. This does happen in Wolves of Eternity, but it is rare. At one point, in a flashback, Sievert is comforting a young girl after she is broken up with by one of Sievert's friends. He caresses her along her back, but realizes that at some point his finger had been cut, so he was, in actuality, wiping blood all over her white jacket. This occurs in a particularly low point for Sievert, and it felt to be a, quote, straw that broke the camel's back, quote, moment. This was the only time in Sievert's story that I felt him to be overdoing it. The rest of it works, because although Knausgaard and Sievert might be very different people according to him, they are really not. If you were to read Sievert's section in Wolves of Eternity, and then turn and go read the 4th volume of My Struggle, you would find an exceptionally close relationship. Sievert is as patient, headstrong, and optimistic as Knausgaard was at that age. Aleftina is going to be the more distant character here. The cultural differences, the sexual differences, means there is an abstraction that occurs, and Knausgaard infuses her story with quite a lot of the pet topics that the author has been considering this past decade. Despite the fact that Aleftina is a scientist through and through, she finds herself asking the big questions about life. In one of her lectures, early in her section, a young man accosts her, accusing of parading answers while still not knowing the big ones, about how memory works, or how DNA knows to replicate itself. She derides him for doing philosophy in a science setting, but ends up right where the young man started, which is suddenly realizing that science in the 21st century is butting up against big questions that science has a difficult time explaining, in fields pertaining to consciousness, quantum physics, the order of time, the sentience of trees, and so on. Aleftina's doctoral thesis centers in on the latter topic in a very similar fictionalized account of Suzanne Simard's book, Finding the Mother Tree, which discusses her work in discovering the phenomenon of trees in communication with one another. Most of Aleftina's section also happens to discuss her relationship to her father and mother, especially the task of trying to earn her father's approval, who was an incredibly bright and successful musician. While Sievert's story is immediate, passionate, and emotional, Aleftina's story is far more heady, reserved, abstract, and intellectual. A reader is bound to prefer one over the other. Before going into the book, I would have told you that I would likely have preferred Aleftina. All the sections in the Morning Star that featured Egil speculating and philosophizing were my favorite, so one could say that Aleftina would have been my section. But it turned out not to be the case. Sievert's story does include some significant takeaways, and it is here that I am going to start getting into spoilery territory. What I see in Sievert is Knausgaard discussing the strange paradox of optimistic people in our world. It seems baffling to us that people continue living while ignoring death, which is a very Heideggerian notion, right? Death is what makes us temporal beings, so perhaps even though we know we are going to die, we still carry on in such a way as to make our lives as authentic as possible. For some, life is so terrible that religion still manifests itself as a sort of cover or explanation to keep our lives inauthentic and still live, because we are promised more life after this. Sievert is a rare breed. His mother is sick, his younger brother needs him, his dad died leaving them nothing, he's unemployed coming out of the Navy at a bad time, and now he's working as an undertaker's assistant, carrying and presenting dead bodies to the grieving survivors. By any measure of our psychological makeup, Sievert should be in a catatonic state. And yet, Sievert finds himself in a state of joy. He is in a budding relationship with Lisa, who we as readers may react to defensively because we do not feel as though Lisa is good enough for our Sievert. She's young, brash, selfish, and seems to play around with Sievert's feelings. And yet Sievert, because he is a young man with an extraordinary reserve of what we would call perhaps well-being, manages to shoulder all of this well. The paradox I am referring to that Knausgaard writes about is the tendency for the most optimistic people to end up with the most burdensome life. Sievert is surrounded by death, and yet it does not faze him, because it is not something that he seems to remark upon. There have been studies among young people that show that they can respond much better to stressful changes in life, either because they are younger and thus blissfully unaware, or because their extreme strength and growth as young people overwhelm stressors. This also helps to explain why the young are sent into wars. This too has some merit in such longitudinal studies as the Harvard Grant Study, where those who have the highest amount of hope, the greatest relationships, and the most optimistic outlooks tend to be healthier. And yet, we also know that pessimists tend to be most accurate when answering questions about the world around them. This is all to say that Sievert clearly does not understand his predicament, and yet it is this very lack of understanding which makes him fittest for survival. It is this ignorance of death that surrounds him which makes him a key candidate for supporting life. It is not something that Sievert consciously does, but rather a kind of altruistic state that nature uses through him. While Sievert lives a life in 1986 that reveals us all this, Aleftina and the reader seem, on the other hand, to be on the same side of the page. For Aleftina sort of guides us through her life as if recounting it to a friend. In this way, we sit side by side with her in a much more clinical and observing way. With Sievert's world, we are incredibly grounded in his time and place, where each minute seems to be accounted for, and rarely does Knausgaard skip around. With Aleftina, we are all over the place, back and forth across decades, circling around the drain to a place where Aleftina ended up in, certainly not where she felt she ought to be. Had I been in my 40s or 50s, and not in my early 30s, I suspect that I would appreciate Aleftina's story far more. Already I can begin to see that a great deal of where I ended up in life seems far more luck, good and bad, rather than any effortful force I applied in my life. Aleftina's story is the far more mature one, tracing the life of an interested and curious mind, bewildered by the scale and scope of existence, into focusing a greater and greater amount of time inwardly, into personal history, into consciousness, attempting to explain to ourselves who we are and what is wrong with us. Unlike Sievert, much of this is done in the spaces between people and art, particularly music, philosophy, and the sciences. And because there are so many more touch points for the reader to get closer to or farther away from, in my mind, Aleftina's section is far more equivocal. A reader has to be prepared to follow along on quite a few big names, like Shostakovich or Heidegger, and even some lesser-known names, particularly in Russian philosophy and literature. For an American reader such as myself, I may have a closer relationship to Latin American and Canadian authors, but Russian works are quite literally half a world away. In this regard, I expect European readers to find Aleftina's section to be far more endearing, because of their ability to follow along a little better culturally. Something I think that Knausgaard is still struggling with is how to put big ideas explicitly into the fictional form. In my struggle, his ability to go straight into heady topics while rooting his own life into an autofictional story was sublime. The downside to this was that the form of his life was, like the rest of us in a developed nation, a little pedestrian, especially once children came around. It was difficult to bridge the gap between domesticity and the philosophy of death and how Earth has become a land of the dead. This was, in my opinion, why, in the 6th volume of my struggle, it sort of spun out of control and became this massive tome that included a non-fiction essay on Hitler. It was like the form of the series could not hold on to his ambitions. In this new fictional series, he has attempted to shift the form of his writing into a new container, with a new set of boundaries. But in doing so, a great deal more time has to be spent answering questions typical to fiction. Who are these characters? What do they want? How do they think? And although a great deal of the more heady characters end up thinking and speaking a lot like Knausgaard himself, he is now able to open up his writing into the existential and biblical scale he desires. I think, for most part, it largely works, though as I've said here, there are some caveats that I think you should be aware of. In both novels, The Morning Star and Wolves of Eternity, he has taken the time to put in essays on topics of death and rebirth. There was an essay by the character Egil on death, and there was a snippet from a book titled Wolves of Eternity that was written by Vasilisa. I suppose in Knausgaard's mind, there was really no other way to bring these themes to light before the arrival of the star without simply writing it directly to the reader in this essay format. When characters are not living their lives and are remarking upon what it means to be alive, oftentimes the exposition can feel like this, and the space between those two modes of his writing are likely where readers will have problems. I, being a fan of his writing, do not have a problem with it. 2 books in, I think it is safe to say that Knausgaard does not believe in having a particular direction for the series. He's not interested in determined and explicit story beats for this series like some kind of genre writer in science fiction or fantasy. He's rather far more interested in the work itself, and showing up each day to write those 3 pages and to get a book out a year, and whatever comes as the dregs of his routine. Love it or hate it, that's what we can expect. For me, as a fan of Knausgaard, I am in love with it. This is because I consider Knausgaard to have a highly trained and sophisticated intuition, and when he leans on it in his writing of characters in their immediate physical surroundings, I happen to believe he gets his finger directly on the pulse of our psychoanalytic experience of the world. His characters' reactions are almost always spot on, which means his emotional intelligence is much higher than most of us. This is what I come to fiction for in the first place. I'm not interested in plots, not really, nor am I interested in characterization per se. I'm interested in someone writing about the strangeness of being alive, and the alienating ways we come to have a body, and how we negotiate between what we want versus what's best for us. There are a few writers out there, as far as I'm aware of, who do this once a year, and so I'm finding the series thrilling. They cannot translate them fast enough. If you think you would like this sort of thing, I would encourage you to give Knausgaard a try, and this new fiction series is a great place to start. Thank you for listening.